They say the ocean hides secrets it will never willingly give back. But one morning, on a fog-soaked stretch of coastline near Cape Disappointment, Washington, a 61-year-old fisherman stumbled across something that would shatter that quiet rule. Half buried in wet sand, crusted with rust and barnacles, a heavy, corroded box lay waiting, as if it had washed up overnight just for him. No one could explain how it ended up there, and the tides had left no drag marks. When the authorities finally arrived and saw what was leaking from the edges of that ancient box, they turned pale, whispering that it should have never been opened. Would you dare to pry open a rusted box abandoned by the sea, knowing you could uncover something you can't ever forget? Let me know what you would have done, and subscribe if you want to hear what was really inside that box. Jack Madsen was not the type of man to believe in stories about cursed objects, or whispers about ghost ships drifting under moonlight, or tales of things washing ashore that should have stayed buried beneath the waves. At 61, with deep-set blue eyes and rough hands that smelled of salt even after a week off the boat, Jack had spent most of his life navigating the treacherous tides off Cape Disappointment, Washington, pulling up nets of rockfish and halibut, returning home to the creaking little house he shared with his dog, Gus. His neighbors knew him as a humble man, the kind who fixed his own engines and helped tourists pull their trailers out of the mud during storm season, never expecting anything in return but a nod and maybe a coffee down at the marina. It was early, too early, the sky still heavy with the last breath of dawn, pale purple bleeding into gray, when Jack decided to walk along the beach instead of heading straight to the harbor. There had been a storm the night before, fierce winds that rattled windows and scattered driftwood like matchsticks along the sand, and Jack felt that restless itch that sometimes made him leave Gus sleeping on the porch while he walked with the morning tide, eyes scanning the horizon for something he couldn't name. The air smelled of wet cedar and salt, the waves rolling in quietly as if they too were recovering from the storm's violence. Jack was halfway down the long curve of the beach when he noticed it. At first, just a dark shape against the pale sand, half covered by a slick of kelp. He might have walked past it if not for the way the sunlight caught on a jagged edge of metal, flashing briefly before a cloud swallowed the light again. Jack paused, squinting. There was something about the way the shape sat, slumped as if placed there, not dragged by the tide. The sand around it was disturbed in strange patterns, as if the ocean had tried to swallow it but the object had refused to sink. He stepped closer, boots sinking into wet sand. The hush of the waves suddenly louder as the world seemed to narrow around that single shape. It was a box, that much was clear, but not the kind you would expect to find on a beach. Heavy iron, pitted with rust and thick with barnacles along the bottom edge, it looked like it had been in the sea for decades. The corners were reinforced with heavy rivets, some so corroded that orange flakes crumbled off with the breeze. There were no visible markings, no names or numbers, only a single iron handle on the top, twisted slightly as if it had once been used to haul the box but had been bent out of shape by something stronger than human hands. Jack's first thought was that it was a bait box that had fallen off a boat, but this box was far too heavy, too solid, too deliberate in its construction. It was about the size of a carry-on suitcase, but the way it sank into the sand told him it was heavier than it looked. He crouched, running his fingers along the rust, feeling how the salt had eaten away the metal until it was fragile in places, sharp in others. He smelled the sharp scent of decay and salt, but there was something else too, something metallic and sour that made him pull his hand back, wiping it on his jeans. He stood there for a moment, looking around, but the beach was empty. No one else was walking that early, and the fishermen at the marina would still be pulling their lines or fueling up their boats. The world was quiet except for the low murmur of the waves and the call of gulls overhead. Jack felt a strange shiver run down his spine as he looked at the box, a heaviness in the air that made him feel like he had just stumbled into something meant to remain hidden. Gus, who had padded up behind him, sniffed the air and let out a low growl, the fur along his spine bristling. Jack glanced down at his old dog, who usually wagged his tail at everything, and felt the unease twist a little tighter in his gut. He told himself it was nothing. It was probably just old fishing equipment or maybe a storage box that had fallen off a cargo ship during the last storm. But the smell, the heaviness, and the way the sand seemed almost disturbed around it made him pause. Jack tried to move it, gripping the twisted handle with both hands, but the box didn't budge. It was as if it had grown roots into the sand. Or perhaps it was simply filled with waterlogged debris weighing it down. Still, Jack was not the kind to leave a mystery alone, especially not one that washed up on the shores he had walked since he was a boy. He stood up, rolling his shoulders, considering whether to fetch a crowbar from his truck or to call someone first. His mind ran through the possibilities: a container of dangerous chemicals, something illegal, maybe even a piece of history lost in the tides and waiting to be found. The thought made his pulse quicken. He had heard stories of things washing up after storms, glass fishing floats, pieces of shipwrecks, even a bottle with a letter that once floated in from Japan, found by a neighbor down the road. But nothing like this. Nothing that felt like it was waiting for him to find it. He decided to test the edges, brushing away sand with his boot until the lower half of the box was revealed. There were strange marks along the metal, scratches that looked deliberate, almost like letters or symbols, but corroded too badly to make sense of them. The lock, if there had ever been one, was gone, leaving only a rust-stained patch where something heavy had once been bolted. Jack reached down, prying at a seam with his fingers, but it refused to open, sealed by rust and years beneath the sea. The morning was getting brighter now, the clouds burning away to reveal a clear blue sky, but the light made the box look even more sinister. The dark metal, a harsh contrast against the pale sand. Jack felt the weight of the air pressing down on him, a sense that he was being watched, though there was no one around except Gus, who now circled the box, sniffing cautiously and whining. Jack stood, looking out at the waves, the rolling, endless blue, and wondered how long the box had been out there, drifting in the cold currents, waiting for the storm that would finally toss it ashore. How many storms had passed before it was finally dragged to this beach? How many years had it been sinking deeper and deeper into the darkness of the sea before the tides decided to give it up? Jack felt that familiar tug of curiosity that had led him into countless coves and rocky outcrops, searching for lost crab pots or checking the nets after a storm, hoping for a larger catch. But this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something he couldn't easily walk away from. He reached down again, pulling at the box, trying to tilt it, and felt it shift slightly, a heavy, wet sucking sound as the sand released its grip just enough for him to rock it back and forth. Inside, something moved. It was not the sound of water sloshing or debris rattling. It was a heavy, muffled thump, followed by a metallic scraping, as if something shifted under its own weight. Jack froze. His breath caught in his chest. Gus barked sharply, jumping back, his ears flat against his head. The sound echoed in the emptiness of the beach, swallowed quickly by the soft roar of the waves. But it was there. Jack was sure of it. He felt a chill crawl up his neck, the hair standing on end as he leaned down, pressing his ear close to the box, straining to hear. For a moment there was only silence, the soft hiss of the tide rolling in, the distant call of gulls. Then, faintly, so faintly he thought he might have imagined it, there was another scrape, a dragging sound from inside the box, like something shifting against metal. Jack stepped back, breathing hard, the wind cold against the sweat on his neck. He looked around again, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the beach was still empty, the world holding its breath as if waiting to see what he would do next. Gus whined, pawing at the sand, looking up at Jack with wide, anxious eyes. Jack knew then that he couldn't leave it there. Whatever was inside that box, whatever had washed ashore in the dead of night, was not meant to be left for the tide to reclaim. He felt that strange certainty settle in his bones, the same feeling he had when a storm was coming, the air thick with the promise of something he could neither stop nor avoid. He would need tools and maybe help, but Jack was determined. He glanced down at the box one last time before turning toward the truck, Gus following close at his heels, the dog stopping to look back at the rusted shape on the sand as if to make sure it wouldn't move while they were gone. The sun was rising higher now, casting long shadows across the beach, the light glinting off the metal edges of the box, making it look almost alive in the morning air. As Jack walked back to the truck, he felt the weight of the discovery pressing on him, a quiet dread mixing with a spark of excitement that he hadn't felt in years. Whatever was inside that box had been hidden away by the sea, kept in the dark for reasons he couldn't yet understand. But now it was here, and it was his responsibility to find out why. And as he reached the truck, fishing out the crowbar and a pair of heavy gloves, Jack couldn't help but glance back at the beach, where the box lay waiting, half buried in the sand, the tide creeping slowly closer with each passing minute. Whatever was inside, he was going to find out. even if, deep down, he felt that he shouldn't. Jack returned to the beach with the crowbar gripped tight in one hand, the heavy steel cool and familiar against his palm, the same tool he had used to pry open crates of tangled fishing nets and stubborn engine hatches, but never for something like this. Gus stayed close, tail tucked but loyal as ever, his paws leaving shallow prints in the wet sand as they approached the box again. The tide had crept closer while they were gone, small waves lapping at the edges of the box, trying to reclaim it, as if the sea had changed its mind about giving it up. Jack felt the wind shift, cold and sharp, carrying the scent of brine and something older, something that made him think of the dark spaces between the waves where sunlight never reached. He crouched beside the box, inspecting the edges now washed clean by the tide, revealing more of the strange marks along the seams. They weren't scratches, he realized. They were symbols, etched into the iron, partially devoured by rust, but still there. Lines that curved and intersected in a pattern that made his head feel tight, like trying to remember a word on the tip of your tongue but never quite catching it. Jack ran a gloved hand over them, feeling the ridges beneath his palm, the way the lines dipped and rose with purpose. Someone had carved these, a long time ago, for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. The tide washed over his boots, soaking the cuffs of his jeans, but Jack barely noticed. He wedged the crowbar under the edge of the box, testing the resistance, feeling the way the metal groaned under the pressure. With a grunt, he pressed down, the box shifting slightly, the suction of wet sand giving way with a deep, sucking pop. Gus barked, jumping back as the box tilted, sending a wave of water rushing around it, swirling sand and seaweed in tight eddies. Jack paused, catching his breath, the crowbar slipping from his hand as he steadied himself. Inside the box, something shifted again, that same heavy scrape against metal, followed by silence so complete that the sound of the waves seemed distant. Jack looked around, half expecting someone to appear, to call out, to tell him to stop, but the beach was empty, the world holding its breath as he leaned down, gripping the edge of the box with both hands, pulling with all the strength left in his arms. It tilted further, breaking free of the sand, falling back with a dull thud that vibrated through the wet ground. Water poured from a seam near the bottom, dark and slick, leaving an oily sheen on the sand. It smelled wrong, sharp and metallic, mixed with the scent of decay that made Gus whimper, backing away with his nose to the ground. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead, smearing salt and grit across his brow as he examined the box, noting the places where the rust had eaten through entirely, leaving small holes that wept dark water. He slid the crowbar into a seam along the top, bracing himself as he pulled, the metal creaking, flakes of rust raining down onto his boots. For a moment he thought it wouldn't give, that it would remain sealed forever. But then there was a sharp crack, the sound of rust breaking, and the lid shifted, just enough for a sliver of darkness to show between the seams. Jack stopped, breathing hard, heart pounding in his chest so loud he could barely hear the waves anymore. He leaned closer, peering into the darkness, smelling that sharp old scent that made his stomach clench. He couldn't see much, only the suggestion of something wrapped in dark cloth, soaked and heavy, pressing against the edges of the box as if it had been packed tightly. Gus barked again, sharp and loud, and Jack jumped, nearly dropping the crowbar. He looked down at his dog, who was now pacing, looking toward the dunes, ears twitching. Jack followed his gaze but saw nothing, only the grass bending in the wind and the faint shapes of driftwood scattered along the high tide line. Jack turned back to the box, ignoring the chill running down his spine. He pressed the crowbar again, widening the gap, the rust snapping, metal bending until the lid was open enough for him to pry it back fully. It fell open with a heavy clang, echoing across the beach, a sound that seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have. Inside, the box was lined with dark rotted wood, the interior damp and reeking of salt and decay. The cloth bundle sat in the center, tied with what looked like rope, but as Jack leaned closer, he realized it was something else, something darker, twisted and stiff with age, wrapped around the bundle in tight, deliberate knots. He reached out, touching the cloth, feeling how it was soaked and slimy, sticking to his gloves as he lifted it slightly. The weight was surprising, heavy and dense, shifting inside the fabric with a dull thump. He set it down quickly, wiping his gloves on his jeans, trying to ignore the way the fabric had left dark stains on the leather. Gus whined again, louder this time, backing away, his eyes wide. Jack felt a prickle of fear crawl up his neck. the air around him feeling heavy, pressing down on his shoulders as he stared at the bundle in the box. There was something wrong about it, something that made every instinct in him scream to leave it alone, to bury it back in the sand and walk away. But Jack was not the kind of man to walk away from something like this. He was a fisherman, used to storms and darkness, used to pulling things from the sea that others would shy away from. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he reached for the knots, pulling at the stiff, dark cords that held the bundle closed. They came apart slowly, crumbling in places, leaving dark stains on his gloves. The cloth loosened, falling open in slow, wet folds, revealing what was inside. At first, Jack couldn't process what he was seeing. It looked like wood, dark and smooth, shaped in long, thin pieces that were bound together with more of the dark cord. But as he looked closer, he saw that it wasn't wood. It was something else, something that made his stomach clench and bile rise in his throat. Bones. Long, thin bones, bound together in a deliberate shape, tied with dark cords that looked like they had been made from something Jack didn't want to think about. The bones were old, stained dark by the sea, but they were unmistakable, shaped into something that looked like a small, crude figure, arms and legs bound tight against its body, the head a smooth, round shape, with empty sockets staring up at him. Jack staggered back, nearly dropping the bundle, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he tried to make sense of what he was holding. It fell into the sand, the cloth unwrapping fully, the bones spilling out in a tangle, the cords falling away like dead snakes. Gus barked furiously now, backing away, the fur along his spine bristling as he snarled at the bones. Jack fell to his knees, staring at the figure, at the way the bones had been shaped and bound, the way the head seemed to turn slightly in the breeze, the empty sockets looking back at him. He felt cold, the wind biting at his skin, the world around him suddenly too bright, too sharp. He looked around again, hoping, praying that someone would appear, that someone else would see this, would tell him what it meant, what he was supposed to do. But there was no one, only the waves, the wind, and the bones in the sand. Jack sat there for a long moment, staring at the bundle, at the empty sockets that seemed to watch him, the bones that looked too deliberate, too carefully bound to be random. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the realization that whatever this was, it was something far beyond what he was prepared to handle. He couldn't leave it here. The tide would wash it away, or someone else would find it, and whatever this was, it felt wrong to leave it for the sea to reclaim. Jack stood, wiping his gloves on his jeans, looking down at the bundle, trying to ignore the way the bones seemed to shift slightly with the breeze. He needed help. Someone who could look at this and tell him what it was, what it meant, and what he should do next. The sheriff, maybe, or the Coast Guard. Someone with authority, someone who could take this burden from him. Jack reached down, carefully wrapping the bones back in the cloth, tying it closed as best he could, ignoring the way the fabric stuck to his gloves, the way the bundle seemed to move slightly in his hands. He placed it back in the box, closing the lid as much as it would allow, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Gus stayed close now, quiet, watching Jack with wide, anxious eyes as he lifted the box, straining under the weight, carrying it back toward the dunes where his truck was parked. Each step felt heavy, the sand sucking at his boots, the box cold and wet against his chest as he walked. As he reached the truck, placing the box carefully in the bed, Jack looked back at the ocean, at the waves rolling in quietly, as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just given up a secret they had kept for who knows how long. Jack stood there, the wind cold on his face, the scent of salt and rust filling his lungs as he tried to steady himself, tried to understand what he had just found, what he had just brought with him. He didn't know what was inside that box beyond the bones, didn't know what the symbols meant, or why the bones had been bound that way, shaped into something that looked like a crude figure, like something meant to be hidden away forever. But he knew one thing: he couldn't handle this alone. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, the screen bright against the morning light as he scrolled to the sheriff's number, his thumb hovering over the call button as he hesitated, looking back at the box in the truck bed, at the way it seemed to sit there, heavy and silent, waiting. Jack took a deep breath, pressing the button, lifting the phone to his ear as it rang, the sound sharp and loud in the quiet morning. As he waited for the sheriff to answer, he looked at the camera, his voice low as he asked, What do you think I just found? Would you have opened it, or would you have left it for the tide to take back? Let me know in the comments below, because I don't think I'll ever forget the moment I heard what was inside that box shift for the first time. If you're still here, hit the like button so we know you're ready for the next part of this mystery, and subscribe so you don't miss what we discover when the sheriff arrives. This is only the beginning. Jack stood beside his truck as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dunes while the salt wind moved through the beach grass in restless waves. The phone was still in his hand. The call with the sheriff finished. The promise made that someone would come out to look at what he had found. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the heaviness in his chest, the echo of the bones shifting inside the box, the weight of the sea's secret now resting in the bed of his truck. It was nearly an hour later when he saw the sheriff's vehicle crest the rise, tires crunching over the gravel as it pulled up beside him. Sheriff Ed Larkin stepped out, a tall man with shoulders broad from years of work, his badge glinting in the light, and his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare off the water. He looked at Jack, then at the box in the truck bed, his brow furrowing as he walked over. "What's this about, Jack?" Ed's voice was calm, but there was a note of caution there, the way he kept his hand near his belt, near the radio clipped to it, as if he could sense the tension that still hung around the box. Jack explained quickly, the words tumbling out, the walk along the beach, the discovery, the shifting inside the box, the bones, the symbols. Ed listened, his face carefully neutral, but Jack could see the way his eyes flickered toward the box, the way he adjusted his stance as if preparing himself for something he couldn't quite name. "Show me," Ed said finally. Jack nodded, pulling on his gloves again, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into the truck bed, gripping the edge of the box, feeling the cold seep through the gloves as he lifted the lid. It creaked open, the rust groaning, and the smell rolled out again, sharp and metallic, mixed with the deep musty scent of something that had been in the sea for far too long. Ed stepped back slightly, covering his mouth as he leaned in to look, his eyes narrowing as he took in the dark, wet cloth, the edges of the bones peeking through, the symbols etched into the inside of the box, barely visible under the layers of corrosion and grime. "What the hell is this, Jack?" Ed's voice was low, almost a whisper, his eyes still fixed on the bundle. "I don't know," Jack replied honestly, swallowing hard. "I found it like this." Ed reached for his radio, calling in a report, asking for the local coroner and a deputy to come down, his voice steady but tight, the kind of voice Jack had heard only once before when a body had washed up near the jetty years back. They waited in silence, the wind moving around them, the seagulls circling overhead, crying out as if they sensed the wrongness of what lay in the box. Gus lay at Jack's feet, head on his paws, eyes fixed on the box, ears twitching at every small sound. Within the hour, another vehicle pulled up, this time a county coroner's van, followed by a deputy car. Dr. Helen Ramirez stepped out, her black hair tied back, her expression unreadable as she approached, pulling on gloves as she walked, the deputy following close behind, a camera already in hand. "What do we have?" Helen asked, glancing at Ed before looking into the box. Her eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained steady, professional, as she crouched down, peering at the symbols, at the dark cloth, at the hint of bones beneath it. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, reaching in carefully, lifting a corner of the cloth, revealing the bound bones, the twisted cords. She paused, her gloved fingers tracing one of the symbols inside the lid, the rust flaking away to reveal a clearer line beneath. Ed looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "You recognize that?" Helen shook her head slowly. "No, but it looks deliberate. This isn't just debris, Ed. Someone made this, someone put this together and sealed it in this box." She looked at Jack, her eyes sharp. "You said you heard something move inside?" Jack nodded, his mouth dry. "Twice, before I opened it. Something heavy, shifting." Helen frowned, reaching in to carefully lift the bundle from the box, setting it on a clean tarp on the sand. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing the bones, the cords falling away, the dark shapes of the long, thin bones arranged in the shape of a figure, the head turning slightly in the breeze. "This shouldn't be here," Helen whispered, her eyes scanning the bones, the cords, the way they were tied in tight knots that had held even against the sea's erosion. It looks ritualistic." Ed shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Jack. "Ritualistic? You mean like some kind of cult? Helen didn't answer immediately. She leaned in, using a small brush from her kit to clear away sand and debris, revealing more of the symbols on the bones, small carvings, lines that curved in patterns that made Jack's head hurt to look at for too long. I don't know, she admitted finally, but it's not random, and these symbols, they're not just scratches from the sea. Someone did this with intention. She looked back at Ed. We need to get this to the lab. Carefully, Ed nodded, turning to the deputy, who was still taking photos, the shutter clicking softly in the wind. Bag it, tag it, and handle it like evidence. We don't know what we're dealing with here. Jack stepped back, watching as they worked, the deputy carefully placing the bones into evidence bags, labeling them, taking more photos, while Helen continued to brush away debris, revealing more of the strange markings. The symbols were clearer now, a mix of lines and curves that seemed to form patterns, repeating in places, almost like a language. Could it be native? Ed asked quietly, glancing at Helen. Helen shook her head. I don't think so. I've seen native carvings, and this isn't like anything from the local tribes. This is something else. Jack felt a cold breeze cut through him, the chill sinking into his bones as he watched the bones being packed away. The box lifted carefully onto a stretcher and wheeled toward the coroner's van. Gus whined softly, pressing against Jack's leg, and Jack rested a hand on his head, feeling the dog tremble slightly. As the van doors closed, Jack turned to Ed, his voice low. What do you think this is? Ed looked at him, his face lined with worry. I don't know, Jack, but I think you were right to call us. Whatever this is, it's not just driftwood and sea trash. Helen walked back over, pulling off her gloves, her expression serious. I'll call you when I have something. But Jack, if you remember anything else, anything strange you saw on the beach, or if anyone comes around asking about this, you call me immediately. Jack nodded, the weight in his chest growing heavier as he watched them drive away, the coroner's van disappearing over the dunes, leaving him alone on the beach once more, the waves rolling in quietly, the wind cold and sharp. He looked down at Gus, who looked back up at him, eyes wide, as if asking the same question Jack was asking himself. What had he really found out there? The beach was empty again, the tide creeping higher, washing away the footprints and the marks where the box had been. Jack stood there, the wind pulling at his jacket, the scent of salt and rust still lingering in the air, the memory of the bones, the symbols, the way they had felt in his hands, heavy and wrong. As he turned back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world was not quite the same as it had been that morning when he had decided to take a walk along the beach. The ocean had given up one of its secrets, but Jack couldn't help but feel that the sea never truly let go of anything, that whatever he had pulled from its depths was only part of a larger story he couldn't yet see. He climbed into the truck, Gus hopping in beside him, the dog pressing close as Jack started the engine, the rumble of it grounding him, reminding him of the simple, solid things in life. But as he drove home, the image of the bones, the symbols, and the heavy box refused to leave his mind. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and the sound of the waves echoed faintly through the air, Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment on the beach, every sound, every shift of the bones inside the box. He thought of the symbols, of the way they seemed to form patterns, of the way the bones had been tied, the head turning in the breeze as if looking back at him. He reached for his phone, opening the photos he had taken before the authorities arrived, zooming in on the symbols, tracing them with his finger, trying to find meaning in the lines and curves that seemed to dance just out of reach of understanding. As he lay there, the sound of the sea in the distance, Jack felt a chill crawl up his spine, a sense that the story was far from over, that whatever he had found was only the beginning of something much larger, something that would not let him go. And as he closed his eyes, trying to find sleep, one question echoed in his mind, refusing to fade. Who put that box in the sea, and why? Jack barely slept that night. The sound of the waves was usually comforting, but now it felt like a whispering reminder of what the sea had delivered to him. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps, every sigh of the wind like a breath at the back of his neck. When morning finally came, gray and cold, he found himself staring out the window toward the direction of the beach, the image of the bones and symbols refusing to leave his mind. It was around 10 a.m. when Sheriff Ed Larkin called. "You need to come down to the station, Jack," Ed said, his voice measured but tight, like a rope pulled too hard. "Did you find something?" Jack asked, his voice low. "We did, and you need to see it for yourself." Jack didn't waste time. He left Gus at home, locking the door behind him as he climbed into his truck, the engine rattling to life as he pulled onto the road. The drive felt longer than usual, every mile filled with questions he couldn't yet form, the lines of the symbols floating in his mind, their patterns unresolved. When he arrived, Ed met him at the door, his eyes shadowed with something Jack hadn't seen there before, worry and a hint of fear. They walked down the corridor toward the back, where the small evidence lab was located. Dr. Helen Ramirez was there, her hair pulled back tighter than before, gloves on as she hovered over a table where the bones and remnants from the box were laid out under bright lights. "Morning, Jack," she greeted, though her voice lacked warmth. She gestured for him to come closer. On the table, the bones were arranged carefully, no longer bound, but laid in the same shape they had been tied into. Jack could see now that the cords had been analyzed, fragments placed in sealed bags along the edges of the table. Helen lifted one of the bags. "This isn't rope," she said quietly. "We ran preliminary tests, and it appears to be some kind of sinew or treated animal intestine. Possibly human-made, possibly old, very old." Jack felt his stomach tighten, but he nodded for her to continue. "We also carbon-dated fragments of the bones. They're human, Jack. Human, and based on early results, we're looking at a possible age range of 70 to 80 years, give or take. It puts them roughly in the World War II era." Jack blinked, trying to process that. World War II? How would human bones from that time end up bound like this, in a box, in the sea? Helen shook her head. "That's what we're trying to figure out. The symbols carved into the bones are troubling. We've consulted with a university linguist who specializes in symbology and esoteric languages. They're not any native coastal tribal marks. They appear to be a hybrid of maritime signal symbols, old runic characters, and what might be a form of cryptic code." She pulled up a photo on the tablet beside her, zooming in on one of the clearer symbols. It looked like a triangle intersected with lines that curved outward, dots placed in deliberate positions. The linguist believes this symbol may be linked to certain secret societies that were active around the WFUE period, specifically maritime smuggling rings that operated off the Pacific coast, using coded markings to identify cargo or signal safe drop points. Jack stared at the photo. The symbol burned into his mind now. "Are you telling me this was smuggling related?" Helen hesitated. "That's one theory, but there's more. In the box, under the false bottom, we found a sealed metal canister, heavily corroded but intact enough for us to open safely in the lab." She nodded to Ed, who handed Jack a printed photo. It showed a small leather-bound notebook, its pages warped and darkened, but writing still visible in places. "We're still translating it, but from what we've managed to read, it appears to be the personal log of a man named Karl Dietrich, a German immigrant who worked as a fisherman off the Washington coast during the early 1940s. He writes about moving special cargo during storms to avoid patrols, about receiving instructions from unknown contacts, and about witnessing something being sealed in the box after a man died on his boat during a run." Jack felt a chill crawl through him as Helen flipped to another photo of one of the pages, where the words, written in a tight, slanted hand, read, "The sea will keep what it is owed, but if it ever returns this, may God forgive us." Helen's voice was quiet. "We believe this box may have been thrown overboard to hide what was inside during a smuggling run gone wrong. The bones could be the remains of someone involved or someone who was meant to disappear." Ed cleared his throat. "But that still doesn't explain the symbols, the way the bones were bound, or why it washed up now, after all these years." Helen nodded. "Exactly. And there's something else. When we x-rayed the bones, we found small metal fragments embedded in the femur, consistent with old shrapnel or possibly gunfire. We're consulting with a forensics specialist, but it looks like whoever this was, they may have died violently." The room felt colder, the hum of the fluorescent lights loud in the silence that followed. Jack's mind was racing, images of the storm, the box, the shifting sound inside, the bones tied like a warning or a message. Ed looked at Jack. "You're sure you've never seen anything like this on the beach before? No one suspicious hanging around? No one asking strange questions?" Jack shook his head. "Nothing. I walk that beach almost every day. I've never seen anything like this." Helen sighed. pulling off her gloves. "We're going to keep the remains for further analysis and consult with state and federal contacts. If this is linked to a WS2 smuggling operation, there may be records somewhere, or families looking for answers." Jack felt the weight of it, the history that had washed ashore in a rusted box, the secrets it had carried for decades beneath the waves. As he left the station, stepping into the gray daylight, the wind biting at his face, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the box had found him for a reason, that the sea had chosen to give up its secret now, after all these years, and that this was only the beginning. When he got home, Gus met him at the door, tail wagging but eyes still cautious. Jack sat on the porch, looking out toward the ocean, the memory of the bones and the symbols haunting him. He took out his phone, opening the photos of the symbols, zooming in, trying to understand. Who was Carl Dietrich? What was the special cargo he wrote about? And who was the person bound and hidden in that box, tossed into the sea to be forgotten? These questions echoed in his mind as the wind rustled the grass and the waves whispered along the shore, a sound that now felt like it was speaking to him, calling him back to the place where he found the box. He opened the notebook app on his phone, typing a note. "Check archives for Carl Dietrich, W. Other smuggling routes, local records." Jack knew he wouldn't be able to leave this alone. The mystery had taken root, the image of the bones tied and hidden, the symbols etched into flesh and iron, demanding answers. And as the sky darkened, the clouds gathering over the water, Jack felt a strange certainty that whatever truth lay behind that box was something far bigger than a single man's mistake during a storm, that it was tied to something deeper, something that had waited in the dark currents for the right moment to surface. He looked into the camera, voice steady, but tinged with the weight of what he had learned. "Have you ever found something you wish you could unsee? Something that makes you question how many secrets the sea still hides from us? Let me know in the comments what you think really happened to the man inside that box, and if you would have opened it if you found it on your beach. If you're still here, hit the like button so more people can join this search for answers, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because we're far from done. I promise you what we found is just the beginning." Jack sat back, the sound of the sea filling the air as the darkness settled over Cape Disappointment, the waves rolling in quietly, carrying with them the weight of secrets still hidden beneath the surface. The days that followed felt unreal to Jack, as if he were drifting just above the surface of his own life, each hour pulled by tides he could not control. The discovery on the beach spread quickly, the small town's whispers carried by the salty breeze, people stopping him at the marina or outside the grocery store, asking what he had found, what he had seen, if it was true that there were bones, that there were symbols, that it was human. Reporters came, their vans and cameras intruding on the quiet streets, asking him to speak on record. Jack refused. This wasn't a spectacle to him. It was a weight that settled into his bones, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but now could not ignore. Sheriff Ed Larkin kept him updated in fragments. The bones had been sent to a regional lab for further analysis. The notebook, partially translated, contained references to coded shipments, mentions of cargo and payments, and vague notes about debts to the sea and rituals for safe passage. It hinted at a smuggling operation involving war refugees, stolen artifacts, and items that could have been tied to black market dealings during W. White. But there was no clear record of Carl Dietrich ever being reported missing, and no missing person reports from the 1940s matching what was found in the box. The symbols, analyzed by experts, remained an enigma. One anthropologist suggested they might be linked to old seafaring superstitions, a way to seal bad luck or death, believing that binding bones with symbols and casting them into the sea could prevent curses from following the crew. Another theory proposed the box contained the remains of a crew member who died violently during a run, and they, superstitious and panicking, used what knowledge they had to hide what they believed was a cursed body. But none of it was definitive. 3 weeks after the discovery, Jack was invited to the university lab to view the final analysis before the remains would be transferred to the state for possible burial or archival preservation. He walked through the long, sterile corridors, the scent of chemicals sharp in the air, the hum of machines constant like a distant storm. The lead researcher, Dr. Patel, met him at the door, leading him to the examination room where the bones were laid out on a stainless steel table, each piece tagged, the symbols carefully photographed and cataloged. "Mr. Madsen, Dr. Patel began. We've confirmed the remains belong to a male, likely in his late 30s to early 40s, consistent with the time frame during WOT. The bone damage suggests he died from internal injuries, consistent with blunt force trauma or an explosion, supported by the metal fragments found embedded in the femur and pelvis. She gestured to a display of high-resolution photos of the symbols. We still cannot translate these definitively, but the closest matches are maritime protective runes, combined with elements that resemble Germanic and Nordic protection symbols, historically used by sailors and smugglers as a form of sea magic to ward off storms, betrayal, and death. She paused, her eyes steady. Whether this was done out of fear, superstition, or as part of something darker, we don't know. The man was likely bound after death, placed in the box, and cast into the sea intentionally. Jack stared at the bones, feeling the cold air of the lab seep into his skin. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare back, silent, holding their story tightly even now. "Why did it wash up now?" Jack asked, his voice low. Dr. Patel shook her head. "The sea gives and takes, Mr. Madsen. Storms shift wrecks. Currents change with underwater quakes. Tides erode sandbanks that have hidden secrets for decades. It's possible this box was lodged in a deep channel, freed only by the last storm." Jack nodded slowly, but in his heart the answer felt incomplete, like the final page of a story torn away. When he left the lab, the air outside was crisp, the scent of salt stronger here, even miles inland, carried by the winds that swept in from the Pacific. Jack looked out at the horizon, remembering the weight of the box in his arms, the sound of something shifting inside, the symbols etched in rust and bone, the whisper of the waves that morning telling him everything had changed. A week later, the remains were given a quiet burial in an unmarked grave funded by the state, as there was no family to claim them. Jack attended, standing at the edge as the bones were lowered into the earth, the breeze moving through the trees, whispering through the dry grass. No words were spoken. There was nothing to say. When he returned home that evening, the sun setting in bands of gold and red over the sea, Jack sat on the porch with Gus at his feet, the air cool against his skin. He closed his eyes, hearing the waves, and wondered who the man in the box had been before he became a secret bound in symbols and thrown to the tides. A smuggler, a victim, someone seeking freedom, or someone who stole it from others. The truth was, the sea had not given all its answers, and perhaps it never would. That night, Jack took out the photos he had kept, the symbols, the bones, the box on the sand. He placed them in a small tin and locked it away in a drawer, but he knew he would open it again. The mystery was not over, not for him. As the wind moved through the house, carrying the distant hush of the ocean, Jack looked into the camera, his voice low, steady, and final. "We think we know the ocean, but we only see the surface. Beneath, it keeps its debts, its tragedies, and its secrets, until the tide decides it's time to give them back. And when it does, we're left with questions we may never answer. What do you think really happened out there, that night during the storm in the 1940s? Do you believe the box was meant to carry away a curse, or was it a desperate attempt to hide a crime? Was it superstition or something darker? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Because mysteries like this, they don't belong to one person. They belong to all of us, waiting for someone to find the missing piece. If you found this story as haunting and fascinating as I did, hit the like button so more people can join us in uncovering these stories the sea brings to us. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tale of what the ocean returns when it decides it's time. Because the sea never forgets, and neither should we. The camera slowly fades as the sound of the waves rises, the last image of the darkening sky over the endless Pacific, reminding us that some mysteries are never meant to be fully solved, only carried with us, like the salt in the wind and the whisper of the tides calling us back to the shore.